Hello, and welcome back to Podcast by Sarah Merz, featuring Hannah McKenna, Margo Waters, Julie Brown, and Shelbie Weightman. Today we are discussing The God of Small Things, chapters 1 through 5.
So, what we should probably start this off with is the point of view that this novel is told in, because that kind of lays the foundation for everything else. So, it's definitely not in first person, and it's told mostly through the limited perspective of Rahel, but it also includes things about other characters that Rahel wouldn't necessarily know. But I wouldn't call it omniscient either, because it's not an all-knowing narrator.
Well, some of them are definitely her own experiences, and so she's telling those from her perspective. But there's certain things about Amu and Estha. That's how you say that, right?
Estha.
That she wouldn't know on her own, so that's not her own perspective.
Right, but it's also important to note that at the beginning they did say that sometimes they felt that they were connected because Estha and Rahel are twins. So sometimes they felt like they had memories that they shouldn't know. What was it? One time Estha woke up from Rahel's funny dream.
They were laughing
because they were connected. A lot of times they referred to themselves as we or us, as if they were one person, although that did separate a little bit more once they grew older.
Yeah, I even found a quote about that. It was very interesting. They said, in those early amorphous years where memory had only just begun, when life was full of beginnings and no ends, and everything was forever, S happened, and Rahel thought of themselves together as me and separately, individually, as we or us, as if they were a rare breed of Siamese twins, physically separate, but with joint identities.
And later on it goes to say that they now consider themselves them instead of separate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think as when they talk more about the future, that's when you see more of the book from Rahel's definitely from her point of view, because they don't see themselves as one person. But I think when they talk more about the things that happened in their past when they were younger, that's when it's kind of more omniscient, because there are things that Rahel talks about or that the narrator talks about that aren't that she wouldn't necessarily know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and later on in the book, this foreshadows, it talks about Rahel knowing what happens with the orange drink, lemon drink man and what he did to Estha. Rahel was not there at the actual time, and then we actually read and hear about it, and it's oh my God, she had to experience that too, and it was already so terrible for her brother that it can be both a blessing and a curse that they experience the same things. Well, in that situation, definitely a curse, but yeah.
Or do we want to talk more about them being one person? Because I have something.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, well, I was talking about after the orange drink, lemon drink man, when Rahel wouldn't go, she said her mom should marry him, and then her mom said if you talk back to people, they'll start loving you less. I think that's kind of when the whole I don't know if there was conflicts before that, but I think that's when the whole definite conflict of who loves who more, and not them being one person. I think that's when you definitely saw that split, because then she started to question does my mom love Estha more? Does she not love either of us? And I think that's when the split between them being the same person and being equal kind of started happening.
Yeah, and that point was important just because it's so relatable for anyone with siblings, really, is that kind of the need to be the favorite almost for so many people. And I mean, a lot of times parents don't have favorites, but you feel if one thing happens, it kind of culminates, and that can lead to a lot of self-denial and self-hatred, just because of feelings of not good enough.
It's not always a conscious thing. It's just you want to be happy for your siblings, but at the same time, you just worry about and it's not even just related to family. It can be teachers, it can be coaches. It can really be any situation that you're in, and that sucks.
And she even questions if a parent has to love their child more. She thinks that her mom might like Sophie more than her, which is her cousin. Or she asks her uncle if he could love them more than Sophie, so kind of she's just not really sure.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about the setting. And first of all, it starts out in India, and so it might be a little unfamiliar to us, but it is definitely a very close-knit community, like, and eventually in the book we hear her talk about how she went from like a little village to a small town, so it has a very like community feel, and so they're very comfortable where they are, and but it's also colonized by the British, so a lot of people feel like the British and like English are superior to their Indian culture.
Right, and it was important to note that when Sophie Mull was coming, they was like said repeatedly, like, you must speak in English when she's here. Like, you cannot speak in, I don't remember what.
It's like male.
Yeah, it was some other more native language. Yeah, some more native dialect, and it was made very, very clear that they were not allowed to use that, and they must use English. So it's
talking about like their like house that they live in, like it just felt very cold and very distant, like from like the people in it to the house itself, and like talking about the river where Sophie Mull died, like it just kind of like gives off like a creepy vibe, and that's
even like with the history house, like there's that like weird house that someone who didn't want to become civilized, like the British, like turned back to the native ways, and so that's like a really like kind of like
the house that they're not allowed to go into.
And it also foreshadows that probably eventually they will go in there, because like Chaco, he like talks about it with them.
Okay, I'm gonna tie this. Okay, this kind of reminds me a lot of To Kill a Mockingbird, because it's like they talk about Boo Radley and his house, and like you know they're gonna maybe not go in the house, but like something's gonna happen. So it's kind of like they talk about this house and they mention it like twice or three times, and like they're not, and like but they don't really like go into detail. So you like know like later in the book it's gonna come up again. They're gonna go they're gonna go into it. Like it's like there was no point in mentioning this creepy house like more than once if like nothing's gonna happen. So in this book I think there's a lot of like, even though it is like a lot of flashbacks, I think there's a lot of like foreshadowing. And,
I think the flashbacks kind of like make more of the foreshadowing because it goes back and forth. So if they're like in the past, then it could foreshadow what's coming in the future.
I think like it's almost like a stream of consciousness kind of way of writing, like going back and forth between thoughts, but it doesn't tell you what you need to know until you need to know it. Like they briefly mention Sophie Mull, but then they like continue on, and then they go back to like the day before she comes, because like it's important to know that at that point. And I don't know, the author does a really good job of narrating through that to use the foreshadowing in a non-confusing way. Like you always know pretty much where you are. Like oh, Rahel is 30 now. Like she's been married, she's back in this town that I can't pronounce. Versus Ayamemnon.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, let's roll with that. I don't know. I kind of like have to disagree with that though, because like where like I do agree that it's a stream of consciousness, like I think it's kind of hard to follow just because like I don't know, like it is like for me like it's a very different like dialect, and like there's a lot of names thrown at you, so like I understand that is like her life and her past, but it's sometimes like I feel like it gets a little hard to like, okay, like are we like back like in her childhood, are we like in like her 30s, like it just, I don't know, I think it gets a little confusing at times, but I mean stream of consciousness is confusing, so yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree though. It's a definite stream of conscious novel. Like even just the way things are described, it's just like how this person is thinking. And I think I think at times it can get confusing, but I also think it does add a deeper level to the novel because it's more, like you kind of get more immersed into the characters through that way.
Like I think that's like what makes it the advanced novel it is. Like, I mean, obviously the subject matter too, but like the ability to read that level is what makes it more difficult.
Okay, so the piece that we chose to rhetorically analyze this time had to do with the plot. And so, it's taking place like right after they were at the theater in the Albish Talkies. I really can't pronounce this stuff.
Seeing The Sound of Music.
Yeah, they went and saw The Sound of Music, and so Estha like could not stop singing in the theater, so he went outside, and then some stuff happened to him, and so then he
was raped.
And so afterwards, like, he goes back in the theater and he tells his mom, like, I feel sick. Like, I think I'm gonna be sick. So they go to the bathroom, and then, like, they come out, and then the vendor, like, the orange drink, lemon drink man, he's, like, being all sweet. He's like, oh, you have a really nice son. And then Amu, Estha's mother, is like, oh my God, he's so nice. And she's like, and he offers, candy, and Estha's like, I don't want his candy, like, I don't want to drink. And she's like, don't be so rude. And so he's freaking out, and you can just feel the tension in this piece, because Amu has no idea what has happened, but, possibly Rahel does, because she experiences these things. But, it's definitely a conflict.
And, like, with that, like I'm definitely, like, gonna put it out there that I cannot relate to this in any way, but I think that it is one of those things where, like, I think the older you get, like, there are certain experiences that, like, are just hard to explain to other people, and, like, other people want to tell you, like, oh, like, you're overreacting, like, why would you think that? Why would you, like, it's just kindness, and, like, really, like, like, only you really know your feelings, so, like, it's difficult when, like, something like that, like, it's obviously not something he would want to tell his mom, and, like, it's just a really hard situation to be in, and, yeah.
And then, and even though most of that is not relatable, like, there is definite, like, pathos involved, because we can feel his fear, and especially when, the orange drink, lemon drink man, he tells Amu, like, with Estha sitting there, like, I know where you live. Yeah. And he's like, I could find you if I wanted to. Yeah. And that just, like, invokes, like, a lot of, like, you feel that emotion.
And I mean, at the time, he was only, like, 7 years old, so he's not really sure, like, what's going on, and, like, so you just feel bad for him.
Right, and it's definitely, you can definitely see a loss of innocence there, because at the very beginning, there is this clear innocence where he's just, he's just talking to a stranger, like, oh, I'm just singing the sound of music, like, oh, where are you from? Like, oh, let me tell you this cool thing that my grandparents own.
And then he gets abused. And
I think that's, like, such a clear, like, with the innocence lost, which is a reoccurring theme in so many books, but especially in this one, I feel like it's very, very clear. But it's described what happens to him in a way that it's both innocent and adult, which is a hard combination of things to get together, which was interesting.
I think it also, at least for me, like, appeals to pathos, like, not with, like, making me feel sad for him, but it made me really angry at Amu, the mom, just because I was like, oh my God, like, how could you make your child, like, go, like, talk to him, but then, like, you have to think, like, she doesn't know, and then so then, like, it's kind of like you have to, like, the author's kind of, like, she does a really good job of making you feel, like, what he's feeling, but then, like, at the same time, you have to kind of think, like, he's the only one that knows, and maybe his sister, because they're, like, weirdly connected, but, like, so you have to think, like, not everybody knows.
And it's definitely, like, it adds to the dramatic irony of the piece as a whole, just because so much that not everyone knows, and it's also, it's frustrating when you read it, because you're like, no, like, what are you doing? This is wrong. And then there's nothing you can do.
Yeah, and I think, like, the author's purpose in this was definitely to show you that even if they are a little bit more up in society, like, even in a poor India, like, everything is not good. And even though, like, you think that Rahel and Estha they were born to married parents, like, for some reason they're illegitimate children, and we don't really know why yet, but that's just another thing, like, we don't really know like, why everything's so bad, but it's trying to show, like, things are not good, and, like, things have happened to these kids that we don't really know everything yet, so it's laying foundation for that. And so it has, like, a lot of credibility and a lot of ethos, because, like, why would, like, a kid lie about something like that happened? And so, like, it's definitely, like, it definitely happened, and it was probably told in, like, the truest light that it could have been. The tone is definitely very, like, somber at that point, because you just feel really bad for Estha.
And he feels, like, immediate shame, because he knew that wasn't right, what had happened to him. But he also had a lot of self-blame. He thought it was his own fault, and although it was definitely not his fault, like, that's what he thinks. Like, he's thinking the whole time he's in the movie, like, before he like feels like he's gonna be sick, like, no one's gonna love me, this was my fault, like, I'm unclean, I'm not a good kid because I did something bad and it wasn't his fault. So you kind of definitely relate to this blame, and it's really unfortunate.
Like, even if you can't personally relate to like an experience like that, which like hopefully like most people can't, like that is like a very common feeling that people like talk about when they talk about like abuse of any kind. They think it's their fault. They don't want to talk about it because they feel guilty, when like in reality they did nothing to deserve that. But that's just like it just like makes it adds to the pathos of all of it.
Yeah, and even though the narrator doesn't like flat out tell you everything that happens in this little conflict, like there are gaps that she knows like we can fill in just like with what we assume happened, because there are some things you don't need to mention, but you still know exactly what happened.
And it kind of like for me goes back to the idea like that I talked about earlier about like who loves who more. Like kind of like he's like, oh well, she's not gonna love me as much anymore. And I think that might be like a recurring like theme in the book. Like they're like the same, they think they're like the same person, they're twins, but it's kind of like which like they're kind of like vying for who can be loved the most, I think.
But then it's also interesting because after it happens, he does have the fear like, oh, like my mom can't love me anymore, I'm unclean. But then he also does wonder like, can she still love my sister too? Because at this time they still felt as if they were one. So I guess he was worried that like his uncleanliness or whatever would transfer onto his sister as well, which is an interesting thought to have, especially when something so personal happens. To immediately be concerned about your sister, I think really shows how close they are.
And that concludes this week's episode of Podcast with Sarah. All right. Podcast you later.